the raid taking out al-Baghdadi, the leader of ISIS, as we've been talking about, was a success in part because of the intel provided by U.S. allies in the region. Ayman Moldeen is with me now for a deeper look at the operation and what it means for the region. So based on what Matt just told us, this role of the Russians and what they actually believe and what they're trying to sow here, how do you interpret that? What is that about?
Well, the Russians are obviously making a play. As Matt was saying, all the countries in the region are trying to claim a little bit of victory in this, whether it is the U.S. with the military operation, which obviously carried out the raid, having been the tip of the spear, so to speak, but then the cooperation of nearby countries. You have the Turks and the Russians and the Syrians all saying, like, we allowed the U.S. to use its airspace. The Syrian Democratic Forces saying we obviously had intelligence on the ground. The Iraqis claiming they were the ones that flipped some of the sources that led to this information. So I think at the end of the day, the big takeaway is that for the United States to carry out an operation of this sort, to kill the world's most wanted terrorist, it relied or required a lot of help and planning, not just of the heroic, brave men and women of the American military, but also the human intelligence gathering of some of our allies in the region, which is ironic because the president has spoken about so many of these countries, whether they're Muslims in general or Iraqis or Syrians or Turks, in sometimes disparaging language, or he berates them. So I think it's interesting to kind of see all of the resources that were pulled together to carry out an operation like this.
Well, let's talk about the actual operation itself.
Right.
How were the special forces able to pull this off? What exactly happened?
So it seems that it originated with some reliable and credible actionable intelligence. And generally what that means is one of the countries or one of the resources or human intelligence capabilities that the U.S. has developed through allies or spies or informants on the ground managed to identify where al-Baghdadi hides, resides, and in this case, was deep inside Syrian territory. And so they had to get assets on the ground. They had to get some oversight intelligence capability to monitor the situation, feel confident enough that there is a presence of an individual like al-Baghdadi there. It's the same thing we saw with the bin Laden raid.
Yeah.
And then after doing so, I think in this case, they're probably, given the nature of how fast it unfolded from start to finish, we understand it began in September and here we are, end of October.
Yeah.
That's a relatively quick turnaround. When you think of, for example, that the Osama bin Laden raid took place over several months, they rebuilt the compound, they rehearsed the operation on a similar compound here in the U.S. This was different. It seems like they got the intelligence, they quickly executed a plan, and then went in for the raid within a matter of weeks from start to finish. That in itself is remarkable. But it definitely required a lot of what they call human intel, and that is people on the ground identifying the target, providing real-time information in addition to confirmation of his presence.
There's been some reporting that this happened despite President Trump's decisions in foreign policy in the region. What do you think, having covered this region so extensively?
It's really hard to evaluate if I don't have all the information, but I can understand why the New York Times obviously is basing that on sources they've spoken to, but I can understand why people would feel that this happened despite, not because of President Trump. And the reason being is that when you have such strong allies on the ground, whether it's the Syrian Defense Forces, whether it's the Turks, whether it's the Iraqi intelligence agencies, they all are there working to provide intelligence gathering capabilities for themselves as well as for the U.S. They have to share that information. And you tend to share that information when you have good rapport, when you have good chemistry and relationship, trust between world leaders, between military to military leaders, generals, between intelligence agencies. So there's two takeaways from this. On one hand, that trust exists on an institutional level, meaning the Iraqi National Intelligence has a good relationship with the CIA to share that type of information. But if they're seeing that the president is talking disparagingly about Iraqis, if he is saying that he wants to cut loose the Syrian Kurds, let them defend themselves, if he talks about them in this negative way about, well, it was after 3 days of fighting that the Kurds kind of came into the mix, so to speak, as he said yesterday or Sunday, I should say, in his briefing.
Yeah.
When you get that sense that he talks about them that way, you could see why American military planners, intelligence officers are probably looking at this and say, hey, we need to quickly act on this before we lose our assets on the ground, before they kind of get upset with us and walk away from any kind of intelligence sharing mechanisms that we have in place.
Can that trust be rebuilt? And are you concerned about that trust being so eroded that for the next time this needs to happen and there's such an important mission that the U.S. will be in a disadvantageous position?
Yeah, absolutely, because the corner word is trust and knowing that you have partners that are going to provide you information and in turn do the same if they need information from you. And so I think ultimately a lot of this is built on personal relationships, and that's not to say that there aren't people who admire President Trump's leadership style, but for the most part in the region, people will find the way he talks, the policies that he's done, the fact that he has cut loose the Syrian Kurds who are fighting with us, alongside us, I think is going to send a chill down the spines of many of our allies, saying like, hold on, we're not going to be able to depend on this leader, the leadership of the United States going forward. And it's something that the Iraqi president himself, Barham Saleh, told Axios in an interview where he said, repeatedly that the United States is just not as reliable as it once was. And so he has reservations about how long, that trust, that cornerstone of the region can be preserved. And this is a president of Iraq who's very pro-Western, pro-American, very much connected to the United States.
President Trump is also trying to talk about the end of the ISIS caliphate. Are we at the end of the ISIS caliphate?
I think if you're talking about it as a territorial piece of land, integrity, continuity, yes, that's probably it. But I don't necessarily think that's a helpful way to think of terrorism. I mean, I would look at it more as an ideology and not necessarily as an organization. What we've seen since, let's say the beginnings and the births of Al-Qaeda, which was perhaps one of the first most pan-global terrorist organizations, is that you kill Osama bin Laden, you destroy the actual territory that they owned in Afghanistan. What happens? You get splinter groups. You get Al-Qaeda in Yemen. You get Anwar al-Awlaki, who is one of the world's most wanted terrorists. You get Al-Qaeda in Iraq, which produced Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, which then ultimately led to ISIS. And then you get Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi. So I guess all of that is to say that what you get are splinter groups that become in themselves more hardened, more extreme than their parent organizations. Don't forget, you have terrorist groups like Al-Shabaab and Boko Haram in Nigeria, all who draw on this ideology. So you may have destroyed ISIS as a caliphate and you've killed the leadership, but in reality, you've also have not done much to combat the extremist ideology. So there's a pull factor and a push factor, and both of those forces are still at play in the region, regardless of whether you kill one terrorist.
I'm sorry, we're out of time because I could talk to you about this for many, many more minutes. Eamon Moldeen, thank you so much for being here. Appreciate it.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.